On a cold night along the Iron Curtain, the forest does not sleep. Searchlights sweep across the hills, trip flares wait in the dark, and somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a border guard fingers the safety on his rifle, listening for the sound of footsteps in the snow. Far below that line of light and steel, in a muddy farm track that has been used for centuries, an old truck rolls forward with its headlights off. In the back, families huddle together in the dark. Among them is a Roma family from Czechoslovakia, guided by people who know every hollow in this landscape, every forgotten path across the frontier. And above all of them, so high that no one on the ground can even imagine it, an American camera in space quietly opens its shutter. In a single pass, it captures more of the communist world than all the dangerous spy flights that came before. This is the story of how the hidden roads of Roma communities and the invisible eyes of American technology intersected along the Cold War frontier, a clash between old-world smuggling routes and a new American way of seeing that left Soviet generals stunned, scrambling, and, more than once, completely outmatched. It's a story designed for you, watching from the United States, because it is not just about shadowy crossings and human drama. It is also about how American engineers, pilots, and analysts quietly changed the rules of the game while the Soviet Union tried and failed to keep up. The Curtain of Steel. After the Second World War, Europe was cut in two. On one side, the Soviet bloc, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, the Balkans under tightening communist control. On the other side, the West, Austria, Italy, West Germany, and behind them, the United States. What looked on a map like a simple line between systems became on the ground a lethal machine. Minefields, watchtowers, tripwires, floodlights, trained dogs, patrol roads, and layered fences turned long-settled border regions into kill zones. People who tried to cross from east to west risked being shot on sight. Cases like that of František Factor, a 33-year-old Czech killed at the frontier, were tragically common. Yet, even before communism, these regions had never been truly closed. For centuries, farmers, traders, and traveling peoples had moved through these valleys almost as if borders did not exist. Among them were Roma communities, whose caravans and wagons had followed seasonal routes across the Carpathians and the Balkans, from village to village, fair to fair, long before anyone had drawn a red line on a Cold War map. Old roots in a new war. Roma history in Eastern and Central Europe is a history written along back roads. In Poland, studies of old gypsy caravans show how Roma groups traced long arcs through the Carpathian foothills, linking isolated mountain villages with market towns on the plains. In the Balkans, Roma families moved in circular patterns between Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Greece, often returning each year to the same encampments, the same river crossings, the same patches of common land. When communist regimes tried to freeze people in place, banning nomadism, forcing sedentarization, and saturating border regions with security forces, those deep memories of movement did not simply disappear. Underneath the watchtowers, the old mental maps survived: a dirt track that cuts behind a hill, a stream that can be forded in summer, a forester who looks the other way. For a small but determined number of people, especially those already used to living on the margins of the state, these maps became a kind of underground infrastructure. Witnesses from Roma communities later described how even under the Iron Curtain, there was an east route to the west, from Czechoslovakia into Hungary or Bulgaria, through Yugoslavia, and then out toward Austria or Italy. It was dangerous, it was illegal, and it relied heavily on knowledge that did not come from maps or official guides, but from stories passed within families and clans. The American problem: how to see behind the curtain. From Washington's point of view, the Iron Curtain posed a different problem. It was not just about individual escapees, but about missiles, bombers, and armies hidden deep inside the Soviet Empire. The United States needed to know, how many rockets did the Soviets really have? Where were their nuclear silos? Were they preparing for war or bluffing? At first, the answers came from a slender, almost fragile-looking airplane with impossibly long wings, the U-2. Designed to fly at altitudes around 70,000 feet, higher than Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft guns could initially reach, the U-2 could cross deep into Soviet territory, photograph entire complexes, and glide back out before anyone could touch it. For a few years, the Soviets watched in frustration as dots appeared on their radar screens but vanished again, reachless shadows that recorded their secrets and flew away. Soviet officers later recalled the humiliation. They could see the U-2 on radar, but their interceptors could not climb high enough, and their early missiles struggled to reach those thin, freezing altitudes. The mere existence of a plane that lived beyond their air defenses was a psychological blow, a reminder that American aerospace technology was operating in a regime they could not yet control. That American advantage did not last forever. In 1960, a U-2 flown by Francis Gary Powers was finally brought down by a new generation of Soviet surface-to-air missiles, ending the era of routine overflights. But that shock of that incident triggered something even bigger: the move from daring pilots in the stratosphere to robotic eyes in space. Corona, the camera above every border. In the late 1950s, under deep secrecy, the United States launched a new kind of spacecraft, the Corona reconnaissance satellite. The idea sounded insane even to some insiders. Put a large camera in orbit, fly it over the Soviet Union and its allies, shoot thousands of frames of high-resolution film, drop the exposed film back to Earth in a capsule, and catch that capsule in mid-air with a plane over the Pacific. In a single pass, it captured more of the communist world than all the dangerous spy flights that came before. This is the story of how the hidden roads of Roma communities and the invisible eyes of American technology intersected along the Cold War frontier, a clash between old-world smuggling routes and a new American way of seeing that left Soviet generals stunned, scrambling, and more than once completely outmatched. But American engineers did it. On the first successful mission in 1960, a single Corona satellite returned more photographic coverage of denied territory than all U-2 flights combined. Within months, analysts in darkened rooms near Washington could scroll over entire stretches of the Iron Curtain, tracing trenches, mine belts, watchtowers, and patrol roads from Poland to the Adriatic. What they found changed everything. The missile gap that many feared, the idea that the Soviet Union had outrun the United States in rockets and bombers, simply did not exist. Corona imagery showed that Soviet strategic forces were significant but clearly behind American capabilities, giving U.S. leaders a quietly confident view of the balance of power that the Kremlin could only guess at. For the men in Moscow, this new reality was bitter. They knew American satellites were overhead, but for years they had no answer that could truly blind them. The sky itself had become another front that the Soviet Union did not fully control, and that awareness seeped down into everything from arms control talks to border security planning. The ground truth: smugglers, refugees, and Roma routes. While American film canisters were being fished out of the Pacific, on the ground, the old business of crossing borders continued. In the borderlands near Trieste, for example, smugglers moved people and goods across the line where the Iron Curtain effectively ended just east of the port. The area became a dense microcosm of Cold War tensions: NATO naval bases and intelligence posts on one side, Yugoslav security forces and communist politics on the other, and in between, a growing black economy of guides, boatmen, and for-hire drivers. Reports from the era describe how organizations recruited would-be migrants inside Yugoslavia, often in bars or cheap hotels, then moved them toward the Italian frontier, sometimes by land, sometimes by sea. Once across, they would be dropped near train stations and left to disappear into Western Europe, heading for France, Germany, or beyond. Traditional underground operators along these borders, people who had long worked in illegal trade, adapted quickly, turning human movement into another line of business. For Roma under communist rule, the choice to flee often came with bitter memories of discrimination, forced settlement, and surveillance. Oral histories collected from Czechoslovakian Roma talk about escapes that began in labor camps, moved through hidden crossings near the German frontier, or followed the longer east route through Hungary, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia before reaching Austria or Italy. Smugglers were part of this story, but so were extended families, old acquaintances, and the deep knowledge of how to move quietly across a landscape without leaving a trace. To Western intelligence services, many of these crossings were just case numbers in reports, fragments in the vast river of information that flowed into embassies, refugee camps, and debriefing centers. But to the people involved, they were life or death bets against an entire system, and they ran under the same sky where American surveillance was rewriting the rules of strategic power. Tech that made Soviet generals sweat. If the U-2 had humiliated Soviet air defenses, the next American aircraft to haunt their nightmares did something even brutal. It outran everything. The SR-81 Blackbird, a sleek black reconnaissance plane built largely from titanium, could cruise at over Mach 3 and at altitudes nobody else could sustain. Soviet MiG-31 interceptors practiced elaborate interception schemes, relying on precise timing and long-range missiles just to get a fleeting chance at a shot. Pilots later admitted that the speed and height of the Blackbird hypnotized everyone. Each appearance triggered intense alarm, frantic radio traffic, and the feeling that they were facing something almost supernatural in technical terms. Despite fielding their best fighters and advanced missiles, Soviet forces never managed to shoot down an SR-81. Every time the Blackbird glided along the edge of Soviet airspace, sensors recording radar sites, airfields, and naval movements, it sent a different kind of message. American engineers could design, build, and actually operate aircraft in an environment where Soviet designs could barely survive for moments. In Kremlin meeting rooms, Soviet engineers pored over scraps of intelligence and fragmented images, trying to understand how the Americans had built engines that did not melt at such speeds, airframes that did not tear apart under that strain. The conclusion was uncomfortable but obvious. The United States was not just ahead, it was playing on a different field. 2 undergrounds, one on dirt roads, one in orbit. Now, picture again that Roma truck on a back road under the Iron Curtain. The driver knows that if he turns left at the next fork, the road dead ends near a patrol trail. Turn right, and there's an old farm track that leads through a copse of trees to a shallow stream, and from there to a border that's just a little less well-watched. His knowledge is specific, intimate, built over seasons of travel and whispered conversations around campfires. At the same time, hundreds of kilometers above him, an American Corona satellite doesn't see his truck at all. It sees patterns, a newly fortified strip along one sector of the border, a row of watchtowers appearing where there were none last year, tire tracks near a once quiet crossing point, a refugee camp that grows a little bigger every month. The ground truth here is not a tunnel or a secret passage. It's an invisible layer of information that only one side in this conflict truly controls. For Roma communities and other smugglers, the challenge is always concrete. How do we get these 3 families across tonight without anyone hearing them? For American analysts in windowless rooms, the puzzle is abstract, but no less deadly. Where are the Soviets reinforcing? Are they shifting troops to crush a potential uprising or to prepare for war with NATO? Those analysts can zoom from a photograph of a single bridge to an overview of an entire frontier, connecting clues that no border guard on either side could ever see at once. This is where the emotional core lies for an American audience. On one level, the story is about courage, desperation, and the old human ability to find a path through danger. The Roma family, the smuggler, the refugee in the night. On another level, it's about something uniquely American in this period, the willingness to push technology to the edge of what seemed possible, to launch cameras into orbit and jets to the edge of space, and in doing so, to make a regime built on secrecy suddenly feel naked. How the Soviets felt that pressure. The Soviet Union was not blind to what was happening. They watched U-2 reconnaissance flights cut across their territory, tracked them on radar, and eventually threw enormous resources into developing missile systems that could finally swat one from the sky. They watched as American satellites began returning photographs that exposed their airfields, missile sites, and naval pens, forcing them to dig deeper, build more bunkers, and spend more on concealment. Each new American platform, U-2, Corona, SR-81, later generations of satellites, was like a test they hadn't studied enough for. They responded by deploying ever more complex air defenses, interceptors, and counterintelligence operations. But the pattern remained. The United States would deploy a technology that changed the intelligence balance, and Moscow would scramble to catch up. For Soviet border troops along the Iron Curtain, that pressure filtered down in subtle ways. Orders changed. More watchtowers, more patrols, more mines, more emphasis on sealing the frontier completely. Even as local smugglers and Roma guides adapted on the ground, the strategic reality above them was being shaped by technologies their officers could barely describe. In many ways, that's the great contrast this story offers. On the communist side, a system that relies on sheer mass, more guards, more fences, more fear. And on the American side, a system that relies on precision, a better image, a faster plane, a quieter sensor. When you watch these stories today from the United States, that contrast is where pride and fascination naturally converge. A repeatable emotional pattern. The emotional pattern you can repeat across many episodes is simple but powerful. First, you open on the ground, in the dirt, the mud, the snow. You let the viewer feel the weight of the Iron Curtain, a Roma family in a truck, a defecting scientist in a stolen car, an East German swimmer at a Baltic shoreline. You show the methods of the other side. Dogs, mines, machine guns, bureaucrats stamping papers in gray offices. Then, without warning, you pull the camera up. You reveal an American technological system that quietly reshapes the scene. And you, too, catching entire air bases on high-contrast film from heights that Soviet pilots can't reach. A Corona capsule landing in the Pacific with more information about Soviet missiles than the Kremlin thinks anyone could possibly have. An SR-71 streaking along the edge of Soviet airspace at 3 times the speed of sound, while 6 MiG-31s twist themselves into impossible intercept patterns that never quite work. Finally, you come back down to the individuals, but now the audience sees them differently. That Roma guide with his intimate knowledge of backroads is not just a smuggler. He is part of a much larger picture, a human thread running through a fabric that American engineers and analysts have learned to read from space. The Soviet border guard is not just a faceless enemy. He is a man stuck inside a system that is constantly discovering, to its horror, that the other side sees more, knows more, and moves faster. For American viewers, that mix, empathy for the people on the ground and pride in the ingenuity that turned the technological tide, is exactly the emotional charge that makes them keep watching. Bringing it all together in one episode. So when you tell the story of a Roma gypsy underground along the Cold War frontier, you can structure your full episode like this. You begin with a single crossing attempt, a Roma family and a handful of others moving through forest toward the Austrian border, using routes their grandparents once used for caravan travel and seasonal work. You describe the tension, the distant bark of dogs, the flash of a searchlight on the horizon, the whispered arguments about whether to trust the smugglers. Then you zoom out and explain who the Roma are, how their mobility predates the Cold War, and how communist policies tried, and often failed, to root them in place. You show how some Roma became victims, confined to camps, forced into labor, targeted by police, while others managed to use their knowledge of the land to slip through the cracks of the system. From there, you shift to the American side, how Washington went from guessing Soviet capabilities to literally seeing them from above. You walk your viewers through the U-2 flights, the shock of the 1960 shoot-down, and the birth of the Corona program, emphasizing how incredible it was that engineers pulled off film-return satellites in an era when spaceflight itself was barely understood. You then intercut. On one track, the human drama of escapes along Balkan and Central European routes, including Roma testimonies about using the East route to get from Czechoslovakia to Austria or Italy with the help of guides and smugglers. On the other, the strategic lens of American reconnaissance, where analysts trace those same border regions in high-resolution imagery, not to track individual families, but to understand the entire architecture of control that those families are trying to slip through. As you build toward the end, you bring in the SR-71, a symbol of how far ahead American aerospace had pulled by the 1970s and 80s. You describe Soviet pilots launching in panic to try to catch a ghost at the edge of space and how, time after time, they failed. You connect that sense of frustration to the broader Soviet experience, a regime spending itself into exhaustion, trying to plug every hole, every leak, every weakness, even as American technology kept opening new fronts it could not fully close. And you close where you started, back on the ground. The Roma family reaches the other side, not because America rescued them directly, but because in this long, hidden war along Europe's borders, two kinds of underground were at work. The earthy, human underground of caravans, smugglers, and old routes, and the invisible, orbital underground of sensors, cameras, and signals that helped keep the balance of power tilted in favor of the free world. For your American audience, that ending invites multiple emotions at once. Pride in the engineers and pilots who made the Soviet Union feel exposed, respect for the courage of people who risked everything at the fence line, and curiosity about what other hidden routes, other secret crossings, and other American innovations shaped a Cold War that was never just about tanks and missiles, but also about roads in the dark and cameras in the sky.